We are all aware, of course, of the shocking context for and background to this event. The last 2 years have seen not only Israel's genocidal assault on the Gaza Strip and total destruction of infrastructure, including, of course, schools and universities, but also the increasing settler assaults on Palestinian villages, restriction of movement and IDF attacks of refugee camps and towns in the West Bank, which have severely damaged education there. It is these events of the last 2 years that have introduced many of us to the concept of scholasticide. The Israeli higher education system is inextricably linked to and complicit in all of this, and has been throughout the history of Israel's occupation of Palestinian lands, its breaches of international human rights, its refusal to honour UN resolutions, and its suppression of Palestinian academic freedom and human rights. In response to the Palestinian call for a cultural boycott, BRICUP was set up in 2004, and in its 20-plus years of existence, BRICUP has campaigned in support of Palestinian universities, staff and students. As we look to the future of Palestinian higher education, never has the urgency of BRICUP's case been greater. The call for an academic boycott is resonating in universities across Europe and large parts of the world as academics join artists, performers and writers in mounting a successful campaign of cultural boycott. BRICUP is proud of its contribution to all this in launching this new, expanded and updated edition of the booklet, Why Boycott Israeli Universities. Booklet aims to arm all academics with the arguments for joining the collective boycott effort through signing up to the academic commitment for Palestine. I hope you've all managed to pick up a copy of that commitment on your way in, and I'll be saying a little bit more about that at the end of the meeting.
My first words would be to thank and pay tribute to our three speakers, Garda Kami, Niamh Gordon and Ed McNally. I've read Garda and Niamh's work over the years with much, learned a huge amount from them and have been inspired by their untiring efforts in support of the cause of Palestinian freedom. Like all of you, I am impatient to hear what they are going to say, so I will myself be quite brief. There are really three broad points I'd like to make. The first is just to say a little bit about the production process. There were three of us who produced the first draft chapters and one of us on the writing team who did all the images. They were cut and pasted into one document, and then about 23, 24 readers in BRICUP and beyond read the booklet very carefully, and all that feedback was integrated into what you have in your hands. So it truly is a collective labor. It is really written by BRICUP, not by individuals within BRICUP. The first thing then I want to say is the reasons for bringing out another edition for the booklet. And the first reason is that there is so much pro-Israel Zionist misinformation in circulation about Palestine, Israel, generated by the parliamentary political parties, the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Democrats and Reform, and by the mainstream media led by the BBC. So that's essential to make the case for Palestinian self-determination loudly and clearly. And in the specific case of the academic boycott of Israeli universities, the misinformation and misrepresentation are especially egregious and therefore need to be combated energetically and in all contexts. One vivid example of such misinformation appeared last month when Universities UK, the body that is made up of 140 vice-chancellors running UK universities, made a public statement regarding the academic boycott. This is what they wrote. This was quoted in The Guardian on the 13th of September. They said, Universities UK has a long-standing public position of being committed to the free exchange of ideas regardless of nationality or location. As such, we do not endorse blanket academic boycotts, as this would represent an infringement of academic freedom. This is such a tired and false representation of what the academic boycott is all about. Since the very start of the academic boycott, BRICUP, the BBC, the BDS movement have emphasized over and over again that the academic boycott targets institutions, not individuals, and that the academic freedom of individuals working at Israeli universities are in no way impeded by the boycott. The only requirement is that such Israeli academics have not themselves been involved in war crimes and genocide, which I'm sure you will agree is a reasonable reason to boycott them. So we have, one of the things we've done is we've posted copies of the booklet of Why Boycott Israeli Universities to all 140 vice-chancellors at British universities, bespoke letters pointing out, please read the booklet, educate yourself. This is not an infringement of academic freedom. And crucially, juxtapose what you read in the booklet with what you say on your equality, diversity, and inclusion statements, your grand gestures about social justice, and think carefully about whose rights and freedoms are being infringed. You'll find that it's people supporting Palestine, not the spurious and arguments that are made out about protecting the academic freedoms of Jewish students. The second reason for bringing out the booklet again is that much has changed since 2007, and I just thought a snapshot of how things have become so much more difficult for the Palestinian freedom struggle, and just to register that, what a different world we were living in 2005, 2007. In 2005, just the political culture in Israel has become so much more right-wing. Bezalel Smotrich was arrested in 2005 in possession of 700 liters of gasoline on suspicion that he was about to participate in the blowing up of the Ayalon highway, and he was held in prison for 3 weeks. 2025, we move forward 20 years, 2 decades. He's Minister of Finance in the Israeli government, wielding enormous influence. Just last week, he was quoted in the Times of Israel saying, "There will be Jewish settlements in Gaza. Without settlements, Israel has no security. We have patience, but we have determination and faith, and with God's help, we will continue with our victories." That's an extraordinary shift, and it's terrifying. A second factor that is also equally bleak is that in 2005, US military aid contributions to Israel were $2.63 billion and an economic package of $360 million, so a total of about $3 billion. In 24-25, US aid to Israel is $21.7 billion. And if you add also the aid that goes from the US to the military funding to the wars in Iran, Yemen, Lebanon, and Syria, the total is $33.8 billion, a $30 billion increase in support for the State of Israel. These are very depressing realities that have to be confronted. On the other hand, I think we also have to take heart from the fact that the prospects for Palestinian freedom have improved. The struggle has been invigorated substantially. The first obvious point is that the scale of global opposition to Israel and the massive rise in support for Palestine is reflected in the growth of the number of countries recognizing its claim to independent statehood. In 1988, 73 nations recognized the state of Palestine. In 2011, it was 122, and now in the middle of 2025, it has increased to 157. I know that can be nothing more than a gesture and be deployed strategically in order to take, instead of taking real action, but nonetheless, it is significant. The second thing to register is that public opinion in Britain has also shifted very, very sharply. It's turned decisively against Israel. I looked at YouGov polls in June 2005, and the pro-Israel and pro-Palestine sentiments of the British public were within a couple of percentages of each other, between 17 and 20% people. In the latest YouGov poll in October 2025, on the 6th of October that was released, only 15% now sympathize with Israel and 37% with Palestine. That's a shift of 22%. The proposition is, do you agree with the proposition, I sympathize with Palestine? Do you sympathize strongly? And do you sympathize somewhat? The combination of a great deal and somewhat actually now comes to 62% of the British population. I think what's really important from the point of view of BRICUP and the BDS movement generally, there remains between 30 and 40% of the British public that says they don't know or don't care. Those are the people who we need to reach. The third success is we have to recognize that the BDS movement and the academic boycott movement has had many victories, and that many universities around the world have cut ties with Israeli universities. In Ireland, in South Africa, in Spain, in Belgium, the United States, Australia, Norway, Slovenia, and Sweden, and many more. I think the most telling admission that the the academic boycott movement is affecting Israeli universities is expressed in a statement that the Israel's Association of University Heads released a couple of months ago. They said in the statement that since October 23, academics at Israeli universities had reported 500 cases of academic boycotts and difficulties with sustaining relationships with overseas institutions. So the Israeli universities themselves have a profound sense of anxiety, panic even, that they are losing the argument, that they are also being isolated increasingly. The next thing I just wanted to summarize very briefly. You all know this, but just to put it in a list, how do the Israeli universities deny Palestinian rights? There are 4 important ways in which they do. The first is they sustain the military-industrial complex by providing the research and development for the arms industry and by training Israeli soldiers in the warfare of occupation. Secondly, they function as sites of surveillance, enforcing apartheid control, and as ramparts of settler colonial encroachment into long-established Palestinian communities. Thirdly, they serve as the Praetorian Guard of Israel's ideological war against pro-Palestine advocates and critics of the State of Israel, producing a constant flow of propaganda for both internal and global consumption. And fourthly, they discriminate systematically against Palestinian students and staff, denying Palestinians the academic freedoms enjoyed by Jewish Israelis pursuing university studies. And finally, I just want to say something specifically about the collusion of Israeli universities during the war on Gaza. We all have read and are aware of the scale of the devastation and the specific focus on the education system, that within 100 days of the start of the genocide, 63% of university buildings had been razed, 5,479 students had been killed, 261 teachers, 95 university professors, and large numbers injured. And in the process, 700,000 school students and 88,000 Gazan university students no longer had access to education. They no longer had buildings where they could attend lectures. And this destruction, that was the first 100 days. This has obviously intensified and continued. This, as you will know, is referred to as scholasticide, and a term coined by Karma Nabulsi, which describes Israel's ongoing attacks on Palestinian education, attacks dating back to the founding of the state in 1948, but escalating from systematic destruction to total annihilation during this onslaught. Now, what have Israeli universities said through all this period in the last 2 years? They're very much in sync with Israeli public opinion. You will also probably have looked at the recent opinion poll of Israel that was published in Haaretz on the 3rd of June 2025, which recorded that 82% of Israeli Jews agree with the statement that the transfer expulsion of residents of the Gaza Strip to other countries is a good thing, and 54% were very supportive. They agreed strongly with that statement. And the principles at Israeli universities are in sync with that sentiment. They put out statements, the Israel's Association of University Heads put out regular statements, and I've followed all of them through over the last 2 years, and they repeatedly echo Israel's right to defend itself. Hamas uses civilians as human shields. Word for word, they repeat Netanyahu's mantras. Never once have I ever, in any of these statements, either individual university heads or collectively, have they expressed compassion for the killing of Palestinian university students and staff, let alone for the many other tens of thousands of Palestinian civilians killed. They are 100% lined up with the Israeli state's project. I'm just going to end off on a slightly different note. The arguments in the booklet are all carefully researched. And what we've done is we've drawn very closely on the documents of international human rights organizations like Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, the United Nations, legal institutions, the International Criminal Court, the International Court of Justice. And we believe that the most powerful way of making these arguments is by resorting to these respectable authoritative sources producing evidence. But I wanted to just end off by making a slightly different appeal, or with slightly different words. The campaign, and this is, I think, the most important thing, perhaps, that I'm going to say, that it's important that this campaign was initiated and inspired by the Palestinian people. On the marches here in Britain, those of us who've gone, we have chanted, "In our thousands, in our millions, we are all Palestinians." The words capture perfectly the sentiment of solidarity with the Palestinian cause and the global scale of the Palestinian freedom struggle. But at the same time, no one campaigning in Britain for the liberation of Palestine ever forgets the prolonged suffering of the Palestinians in Gaza, in the West Bank, in East Jerusalem, and in enforced exile across the globe. So my closing words, I just want to read you a very short poem by a Palestinian university student, which encapsulates what's at stake. The poem is by Basman Darawi, who was a graduate in physiotherapy in Al-Azhar University in Gaza, who's currently living in exile in Egypt. It's called A Degree in Surviving Assaults. As I say, it's just a short poem, and I'll end with this. If there were a degree bestowed for surviving armed assaults, I would have earned it with honors, magna cum laude. I'm living through my fourth now, although I'm not sure if I will make it to graduation. If you test me, I bet I'd ace the exam. I can tell the difference between the voice on F-16, F-35, and Apache helicopter. I can immediately detect whether a sound is the shelling of tanks or bombing from airplanes. But with my degree has come different types of syndromes: phobia of the night, hypersensitivity to the sound of moving chairs or really any banging object, insomnia from anticipating death. I have also learned a few truths. First, the world is hypocritical, yet it is full of hidden gems, good people willing to speak out. Second, actual death is when you don't stand up for what is right. And third, no matter what, Palestine will always be my home. Now, BRICUP have tried to line up with the good people willing to speak out, to stand up for what is right. And the booklet is a small part in the struggle to ensure that tens of thousands of Palestinian students like Baswan Darawi will no longer be restricted to degrees in surviving assaults, but will be free to pursue their studies in safety and to contribute to their communities in a free Palestine.
Well, good evening, everyone, friends, comrades, fellow sympathizers with the Palestinians. It's so unfortunate that we are meeting at a moment like this, a terrible moment in Palestinian history. I can't think of anything really much worse than what's been happening since 2023. That's, of course, I'm talking about Gaza, but I'm also talking about the West Bank and, to a lesser extent, the Palestinians in East Jerusalem. It's a very bad moment in the history of the Palestinians. And yet, at the same time, I want to draw your attention to the fact that if we wanted to put all our efforts into fighting Israel, into trying to just restore some sort of balance to this struggle, there could not be a better moment, because Israel is isolated. It's never been more isolated. And despite official support for Israel, in all other ways, Israel is a pariah state. It really is. So this is the moment to strike, actually, when Israel is, despite appearances, is in fact quite weak. Let me just say a few words about the significance of education, and particularly academic education, for Palestinians on the one hand and for Israelis on the other. Because when we really understand that, everything else follows from what I'm about to say. First of all, for the Palestinian people, education has been their predominant way of resistance and of reclamation of their own identity, culture, history. And not only that, but most important of all, for their dignity. To be educated, to be able to excel in academic studies is a way of affirmation that the Palestinian people have not been destroyed, that they are still there. And also, don't forget, for a people who have lost their land, the importance of getting degrees and license to make your own, to practice in various trades and professions meant you could at least support yourself and your family. And I can tell you a personal story here. I remember as a very young person, I was very keen on literature, on history. I told stories, I wrote very bad stories. The time came to apply to university, and I naturally gravitated towards the arts. And I remember a conversation between my parents. My father said, "I'm absolutely against this. I am absolutely against it. So she gets a degree in history, and she gets a degree in literature. How does that pay the rent? No, she is going to study medicine. Because," he said, and I always remember that, "because she will have a piece of paper, her diploma, which she put in her pocket, and if we ever were thrown out of England, as we lost our home in Palestine, she will go somewhere else and be able to practice." So that's a very practical illustration of the importance of education for Palestinians. And many, many examples you might have heard of, but I can certainly tell you, of uneducated, or in fact even illiterate parents who have saved their life savings, they've sold things in order to put an offspring, usually a boy, through the university. Such is the importance of education for Palestinians. Now, let's look at the other side of this, which is, what does this mean to Israel? Well, for Israelis, and I'm not telling you anything new, for Israelis who had to invent, well, first of all, they invented themselves, a motley group who got together in a piece of land, not their own, and then had to invent some kind of togetherness, some kind of group identity, and had to invent a history and a culture for this new invented entity called Israel. At the same time, as they strove to create this kind of distinctive history, a national history, it was very important to the Israelis then and now to destroy Palestinian history and Palestinian culture. So you can understand that if you are desperate in your efforts to create a new entity, this thing called Israeli, and give it distinguishing characteristics, such as a history in the land, such as cultural customs, you fight the real inhabitants of the land. You demolish their history, you counter their history, you steal their culture where you can, in other ways you denigrate that culture. And you see that everywhere. It began in 1948 in the theft of books from private homes. I don't know how many people are aware of these book robberies, but they took place in 1948 and thereafter, where various educated Palestinians had collected books sometimes very precious, old Qur'ans, for example, and the Israeli soldiers came into these homes and among the things they pillaged, it was very important to take away the books and put them in the Hebrew library. They went into the Hebrew library under the category of absentee property, which is where they still are. My father had a collection of books, a very large collection, and we lost it, and for all I know, it's sitting in the Hebrew library now. So from the start of 1948, the impetus for Israel to appropriate archives, historical archives belonging to Palestinians, which record the history of the people and record the history of Palestine, was a primary objective. And of course, people know in 1982, the PLO Research Center in Beirut, which had a huge archive of really irreplaceable documents, the Israelis took them all during that assault on Lebanon. Likewise, Orient House, which people may know is in Jerusalem, and had and contained many, many maps and much about the history of Jerusalem, was likewise plundered by the Israelis. And of course, our most recent example of the assault on education is Gaza. I don't want to repeat what David has so ably described to us, the destruction of universities, the destruction of schools, the destruction of, therefore, the physical infrastructure of education has gone, and the people involved in teaching and in imparting education have been killed. So many of them have been killed. So that's the most glaring, blatant example of this assault, this Israeli assault on the Palestinian history, memory, culture, customs, etc. Well, having drawn these two, sketched out the way these two communities regard education, you don't have to have a degree in rocket science to understand that this is a perennial battle, that the usurper side, the one that wants to invent a new history and is desperately anxious to demolish the history, the real history of the place, will constantly fight and destroy and attack the history and therefore the education and the academic institutions of the other side. So to my mind, if you have that model in your head, it's not very hard to see why what we've seen, we're seeing. It's in that sense, I think, that one needs to see the academic boycott. It's so important for academics all over the world to come in on the side of the Palestinians, to join the fight against annihilation, against extermination in this very specific sense by the Israeli state. I cannot describe vividly enough how important it is for academics to take this stand, because of course it follows from what I've said and also from the history of the people who made up the ruling class in Israel. Academic respectability is extremely important for Israelis, extremely. Hence, they've gone to enormous lengths to set up awards and prizes, and they've tried to attract great intellectuals to be given these prizes because to them it's very important to be in the ranks of the civilized, the intellectuals of the world. And you hit them where it really hurts when you boycott and you refuse to deal with the academic institutions which are complicit in Israel in exactly this particular exercise. And I don't want to go on for much longer, I suspect I've run out of time. How am I doing? All right. We have precedents, right? We have precedents. South Africa, in 1960, from 1960 on, to which the boycott of apartheid, history, culture, etc., which ended in a UN General Assembly resolution in 1980, which put the boycott of academic and cultural boycott of South African apartheid government and institutions firmly on the international agenda. This has not happened for Palestinians. On the contrary, a more recent precedent is the Russian-Ukraine war, in which Russian academics are not welcome anywhere. They are boycotted. Their articles are not published in journals because of the invasion, the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Apparently, this has nothing to do with Israel. These precedents have no relevance whatsoever to the Israel example. And that's the thing that we've suffered as Palestinians for as long as I can remember, that Israel is an exception. Nothing that applies to everybody else applies to Israel. It has a very special place, and we Palestinians have to get used to it. So I want to end by saying I cannot urge too strongly that academics should all engage in the boycott of Israel. I cannot urge them too strongly to do that. I think it's their moral duty. And I really think that if there is an academic who says, I don't know about this, I don't want to involve myself in politics, any of these excuses, they are not acceptable. For me, those people are as complicit as the Americans who arm Israel, as the British government which supports Israel. Academics who take no part in this, who are not interested or are indifferent, are indistinguishable from the people who support the genocide in Gaza. They are complicit in the way that so many other people, your 40% that you talked about, are complicit by their silence and their inactivity with the genocide. And I can only urge that the booklet which BRICUP has produced, which is really first class. It has all the details in it, which I didn't want to go into because it's so ably explained. I don't need to repeat what you will find in this wonderful booklet. This is an expression of a willingness, of a determination on the part of decent, moral people to try and do their part, play their part in the struggle to support and to save the Palestinian people. Thanks.
So when Jonathan wrote to ask if I'll be happy to speak at this event, I was reminded of an article I wrote in 2003. 4 years earlier, I received a job at Ben Gurion University, and I was a young lecturer there. And that was when I think the academic boycott began to kind of gain ground. So we're talking 25 years ago. And so in 2003, I wrote an article, and you can probably Google it, Why I'm Against the Academic Boycott. And so what I want to do in the 10 minutes that I have here is offer what I think the two main arguments against the academic boycott, and then argue against myself. Okay, if that's okay. So I think there's two arguments against the academic boycott that you'll hear. And we need to know these arguments because we need to respond to these arguments. And the arguments are, one is a kind of general intellectual argument about the academia and about knowledge exchange and about the importance of knowledge exchange for the development of knowledge. And that is a central argument that you'll see with grant agencies, and you'll see it by the universities when you go and talk with them, our own administrations here in the UK, and ask them to stop partnerships. That's what they're going to tell you. They're going to tell you that the whole culture of academic work is a culture of cooperation and collaboration, and in terms of advancing knowledge. Okay? The other argument I made then against the academic boycott was that the universities were islands of freedom in Israel. The universities were the spearhead of critical thinking, also critical thinking against the Israeli government. The Israeli government itself doesn't like those in the universities that are critical. And if you support also a notion of change from within, you need to support these academics inside Israel that are against the government and what the government is doing, and an academic boycott will hurt them. So those were basically the two arguments, and I think when I talk with my colleagues, or when I go to Europe and Afghan since October 7th to speak to several university leaders in universities in different countries in Europe to try to convince them to support an academic boycott, these are the two arguments that I've heard back, and these are arguments that I made years ago, so I know them. And so I would like to talk about these. Now, before I talk about these, I want to talk about the demography of Israeli academia, the Jewish demography in Israeli academia, particularly the staff. And I will divide the staff to three groups. One group supports the government. It's not the biggest group probably in the Israeli academia, but it supports the government, it supports its policies, and this includes the genocidal policies in Gaza, but it includes supporting the first Nakba, it includes, the settler colonial structure of Israel, and it's a support of that. There's a group of academics that support that. They are not the majority, I think, but they're a substantial group. The majority I would call the liberal Zionist. These are the people that in the 35 weeks before October 7th filled the streets of Tel Aviv every Saturday night against the judicial overhaul. They are not interested in the fact that the Supreme Court of Justice in Israel is a colonial court that does not really respect the rights of Palestinians, but only the rights of Jews. They were fighting for a Jewish democracy. Okay, if such a term exists, I would call it an apartheid democracy, but they were fighting for basic human rights for the Jews. They were not fighting because the same Supreme Court that they were scared that is going to be hit by the Netanyahu government, that same Supreme Court for 70 or so years was stamping on the rights of Palestinians, and there's been many works on that. So that's the big camp in the Israeli academia. And then there's a very small camp of anti-Zionists, okay? And these are people that will go to Masaf Ariata and serve as protective, I don't know how it's called in English, but to protect through direct action the people there. These are people that know what's going on in the West Bank. These are people, when October 7th, when the clampdown immediately on after October 7th against Palestinian students and staff began, these are the only people that voiced any kind of protest against what the universities were doing, while the liberal Zionists and the other Zionists were at the forefront of this clampdown. So if we have a Professor Nader Shalhoub Kevorkian, that was wrote a petition against the slaughtering of children in Gaza. That's her field also of research, unchilding, she calls it. So she wrote a petition, or was among the writers of a petition. She was suspended from the university. She was arrested. She was harassed and violated in prison. And most of the staff members in her department supported what the Israeli government and what the university did to them. And only a very small minority was against it. And that small minority, I would say, supports the academic boycott, even though they're teaching in these universities. Okay? So this is kind of the demography, and indeed, right after October 7th, we saw an immediate clampdown of hundreds of, 150 students, something like that, several staff members, 150 students that were suspended, many of them arrested, some of them underwent torture because of posts they put on Facebook, and often it was Israeli students that were monitoring their Facebook pages and passing on the information to the university authorities and to the police. So this is the kind of situation. Now, the university complicity is twofold. It's both personal, on a personal level of individuals, and it's both structural. And the structural is, I'll give you 3 examples of kind of structural complicity with what is going on. David spoke here a bit before of other examples. I'll just mention 3 examples. One is in the humanities and social sciences. So in the Middle East studies, students are taught Arabic, but they're taught Arabic, and there's been studies about the way Arabic is taught in Middle East studies in Israeli universities. It's not taught for me to have a conversation with Palestinians in the street. It's taught in a certain way that it benefits the intelligence service, so that people will later can listen in on phone conversation and so forth. So it's and there's Jonathan Mendel, who wrote his PhD, I think, at Cambridge University, wrote about how Arabic is taught in Middle East Studies department in the service of security and in the service of domination and surveillance. 2 is archaeology. Archaeology is a field that is basically interested in our history, and what the archaeologists in Israel have done systematically, and of course there are exceptions to this rule, but as a field, it has set to itself a goal to uncover the Jewish past in Palestine and to dig in that way. Now, academically, intellectually, that is a problem because archaeology works in layers, and the idea is you have to go through the layers and see who lived in this land and what cities and what towns and what villages, what they grew. And what the Israeli archaeologists have done systematically is ignored all the layers of Muslim and Palestinian existence in Palestine, hundreds of years of archaeology, in order to dig further to try to find Jewish existence. So again, it's a way of, in the service of politics, in the service of ideology, that there was an existence here and it's a return and it's not a settler colonialism and all that. I have 2 minutes, I'm told. I'll give 2 more. The other one is the sciences, which David talked about, and that is about basically the idea of supporting the military, the surveillance apparatus, and there's several basic sciences that are doing that. And then there's the training of security forces and security officers. My department at Ben Gurion University, they taught pilots, and I just wanted to, and these are the pilots that killed tens of thousands of people in the first few weeks after October 7th. I'm sure many of them were educated and received their first degree at Ben Gurion University, but they received their first degree in 1 year. So the university gives them in 3 semesters, winter, spring, and summer, a BA. Okay, so academically, it's a sham. Okay? And it's all a money-making thing with the Air Force, and it's all so that the pilots, when they finish pilot schools, they can also say they have a BA. So that's how it works. Each university, it has its own security forces that they train and so forth. I have 1 minute, and I'm going to probably take 2 more. So there is this complicity, and I would like to end with 2 letters and say a word. So the first letter is a letter that came out about a week ago and sent to all the staff members at Hebrew University by the president and provost of Hebrew University right after the 20 hostages were returned, the next morning. And I'll read to you this letter so you get a sense of kind of the atmosphere of what's going on in the university, and then I'll read another letter. Friends and members of the Hebrew University community, after 2 difficult years of pain, worry, and anticipation, the heart finally knows a little comfort. We are excited about the return home of the kidnapped to their families and hope for days of healing and rehabilitation. We will continue to hope for the return of all the deceased kidnapped. Even on this day of joy and relief, we remember with heavy hearts the civilians and soldiers who were murdered and killed in the war, their families whose tragedy has no cure, and the thousands of injured in body and soul. We cherish the combatants and the members of the security forces who sacrificed their lives in the longest war in the country's history. Among the forces who served are about 8,000. Among the forces who served, about 8,000 were our students whose heroism will be engraved in our hearts forever, and we thank all those who still protect us every day. These days, the feeling of joy is mixed with a feeling of sadness, along with a lot of hope for the future. Even at this time, we at the Hebrew University community are required to look ahead and fulfill our commitment to building a better future, a future of reconciliation, of research, innovation, and development, of academic cooperation in Israel and around the world, and of promoting a space that enables a better reality for future generations. So we have 2 years of war, we have a genocide. We have what was called here scholasticide or edgicide. Every single university was destroyed. 85% of the schools were destroyed. We know the numbers that were killed, and not a word about Gaza, not a word about the suffering in Gaza, not a word about it's all about us being the victims after 2 years. This is the atmosphere at Hebrew University. And Hebrew University is among the better ones. And I'll finish with another letter, the final letter, a shorter one paragraph. It's not a letter, it's a report. And it is the answer to the argument of collaboration, that institutions need to collaborate and that knowledge exchange and so forth against the academic boycott. And it's a paragraph written by the American Association of University Professors, the most important professional association of university professors in the United States or in North America. And this is what they explain. The AA, and they revised their policy in 2024. They were against an academic boycott until 2024, and this is what they explain in the revised policy. The AAUP revised policy maintains that academic boycotts are not in themselves violations of academic freedom and can instead be legitimate tactical responses to conditions that are fundamentally incompatible with the mission of higher education. The statement recognizes that when faculty members choose to support academic boycotts, they can legitimately seek to protect and advance academic freedom and fundamental rights of colleagues and students who are living and working under circumstances that violate academic freedom and one or more of those rights. In such contexts, academic boycotts are not in themselves violations of academic freedom. And I'll end with that. Thank you.
Hi everyone, thanks very much for having me. I won't speak for too long just because it would be good to have lots of time for discussion. But I wanted to make sort of 4 rough points. I was going to have one about scholasticide, but I think that's been well covered so far. So my first point, I suppose, is in terms of the academic boycott is, if not now, when? When the call for the academic boycott was first made in the 2000s, and when the first edition of this BRICUP pamphlet was issued in 2007, the case for the academic boycott then, I think, was pretty unanswerable. Ensuring our institutions aren't involved in any way in reproducing Israel's systems of oppression was already then an essential task. Lots of motions in that time period have been passed in support of BDS and specifically in support of the academic and cultural boycott. But I think the crucial thing from PSC's perspective, especially in light of the genocide, is that it's happened more often that these policies have been passed and not put into practice. So there's lots of trade unions in this country, for example, who formally support BDS, but the extent to which, and the academic boycott, but the extent to which those policy motions have been put into practice is a separate matter. And obviously every single dimension of the case for the academic boycott has been strengthened like tenfold by the genocide in Gaza, as we've heard about already, and as the booklet elucidates very well. We know that Israeli academic institutions are absolutely central to the reproduction of the system of apartheid and settler colonialism. If we can't make the academic boycott a reality and actually implement it in our workplaces and in our unions now, then when will we be able to? As Garda touched on, Israel has never been more unpopular. We're all witnessing this unfathomable atrocity in front of our eyes every single day. So I think, we really need to now have that shift from policy motions and rhetoric to implementation and action. And I think potentially one reason this shift hasn't taken place is that it's hard to grasp the sort of the full moral seriousness of what we're seeing in Gaza. You know, this is a world historical atrocity. It's an irreparable evil on the scale, you know, that you hear about that's written about in school history books as like an example of evil in general. And I think, you know, that imposes heightened obligations on us to organize and really make sure we're implementing BDS rather than just talking about it. So that's the first point. The second point was, I mean, I wanted to pick up on something in the booklet. I mean, there's a fantastic section which sort of rebuts claims about why the academic boycott is bad and then gives the reality. But I wanted, in a sort of comradely fashion, to slightly disagree with one of them in a productive fashion. So, I mean, one bit of this section says, because obviously something that's often said against the academic boycott, as we've already heard, is that it's a violation of academic freedom. And Jonathan, I think, quoted Universities UK, the university employer body, saying, Universities UK has a long-standing public position of being committed to the free exchange of ideas regardless of nationality or location. As such, we do not endorse blanket academic boycotts, as this would represent an infringement of academic freedom. And in the booklet, the way this is framed is, so it says this claim, you know, academic freedom is the highest value of academia, therefore we can't do academic boycotts because it violates academic freedom. And what it says in the booklet as a rebuttal is, well, no principle is inviolable in all cases. But I think it's important for us, when we're making the case for the academic boycott, to insist that it is actually an extension of academic freedom, and in arguing for the academic boycott, we are defending academic freedom. You know, why do we believe in academic freedom as a universal freedom, which everyone everywhere should be able to enjoy? And we know, you know, there's lots of evidence for this in the booklet, we all see it every day. Israeli academic institutions are central to the project of obstructing Palestinians from being able to enjoy academic freedom. So I think it's really important that we insist, when we're arguing for the academic boycott, that, you know, to boycott Israeli universities is to advance the cause of academic freedom rather than to obstruct it. And I think it's really important we remember that. Then two more points, which are sort of more about the present situation. I mean, I think it's potentially worth tying in this discussion as well to the Maccabi Tel Aviv stuff, because, you know, the academic boycott was originally called for as part of PACB, right? The academic and cultural boycott as one campaign. And I think it's interesting, right, that the cultural boycott and the academic boycott are similar also in that they're vigorously opposed. They seem to pose more of a threat in some ways than other parts of BDS, and they cause this, really visceral reaction. I mean, I work for UCU. I mean, I'm not speaking in UCU capacity today. I'm here for PSC, but many of you will know that when UCU in 2007 first passed policy in support of the academic boycott, we ended up in a very protracted legal case driven by the Israel lobby, just trying to defend the legality of that decision. And we've all seen the hysteria over the Maccabi Tel Aviv situation around the football fans in recent days. And I think this is potentially because, if we actually look at Israeli academic and cultural institutions closely, rather than the sort of fake image that's presented of them, it becomes clear, how thoroughly genocidal settler society has become. And I think it's important for them to hide that, for the establishment to hide that at all costs. And it's almost like, if they admit that Israeli football teams and universities are are themselves basically genocidal institutions, it then becomes very hard to defend any last scrap of Israel's legitimacy in general. And then the final point, I suppose, is about just the broader political context we're in at the moment, where in the wake of the so-called ceasefire, I think we're already, and I think the football fan situation speaks to this, we're already witnessing a very aggressive attempt to renormalize Israel and pretend as though the genocide, it's as though, if you read in the news in recent days, right, it's as though the genocide hadn't happened. It's just we're straight back to the same old nonsense. And I think, we have to see this as really an extremist and an anti-democratic effort to make sure that the popular anger and the popular revulsion against Israel, which we see reflected, across the West in opinion polls. I mean, there was a YouGov poll saying, 42% of people agreed that the Maccabi fans shouldn't be allowed to attend the game. It's an effort to make sure that popular anger never translates into policy, and that the genocide doesn't actually result in any fundamental shift in the policy of our governments towards Israel. And I think, trying to stop Israel's isolation, and that's incredibly important in terms of guiding our action, because it means, and again, I think Garda touched on this isn't a moment to demobilize. We need to ramp up. This is precisely the moment at which we need to ramp up, because this is, we can't go back to normal. We can't allow them to pretend that the past 2 years hasn't happened. We need to organize tirelessly until Israel is actually treated materially as the genocidal pariah state most people know it to be. And I think, for those of us who are academics, trade unionists, anyone associated with universities, that means making sure the academic boycott is now implemented. We can pass it as a policy motion as many times as we like, but it now needs to become a reality. And I think it's up to us to organize in our workplaces and our branches and stuff to make sure that happens. But yeah, I'll leave it there and we can have a good discussion. Thank you.
The first thing I wanted to say is that it is absolutely clear that the academic boycott is hitting hard. And the impact of the academic boycott is increasingly being voiced with concern within Israel itself. And for Israel, alongside boycotts by institutions, the cutting of ties by institutions, the concern is also over the boycotting of Israeli institutions by individuals or teams of academics. And this is evidenced in unanswered emails, collaborations that quietly vanish, contracts that are left unrenewed. And this is the likely reason for the dramatic reduction in the ERC Horizon grants to Israeli applicants this year from an average success rate of 29% to only 9%. So you can imagine that Israeli academia is very worried about this. And it's a testament to the power of the boycott. And what will come of it is probably a bit of a moot point, but on the 28th of July of this year, the European Commission proposed to partially suspend Israelis' participation in Horizon Europe from 2028, which must be making them even more worried. So I think we can see that Israel cannot ignore this kind of pressure. We know that boycotts work, but their strength and effectiveness is as a collective effort and even as a mass action. Individuals participating need the confidence of knowing that they are part of a visible movement of academics. This is the thinking of the academics in Sweden who've launched a boycott of cooperation with Israel. A boycott of cooperation with Israeli institutions. So far, over 2,700 academics, including hundreds of professors, have signed the boycott declaration. Here, in the UK, the vehicle for making the boycott actions of individuals and academics a visible, collective action is the Academic Commitment for Palestine, a copy of which you should all have. As David outlined in his talk, the booklet launched this evening is designed to provide compelling arguments for boycott. And as Ed made, it's not enough to have the arguments, we have to move to action. And it's based on those arguments that the Academic Commitment for Palestine is the way in which individual academics can join their voice to the ever louder clamour for justice for Palestine. The academic boycott, as people have said, applies to all Israeli universities, but it doesn't apply to academics employed at Israeli universities in their individual capacities. And as we heard from Niamh, there are a small proportion of anti-Zionist academics who are in favour of the boycott, who see its value. So it's important that we see the pressure being exerted on the system and the institutions. There are two elements in the academic boycott, the individual commitment of scholars to cut formal ties with Israeli institutions, and that includes not submitting papers to Israeli journals, not attending conferences in Israel, not engaging in joint projects with Israeli institutions, not engaging with activities or organising that normalise Israel settler colonial project, and not accepting any Israeli academic prizes or grants. The second is the institutional boycott. And this is where we as individuals need to also be putting pressure, because we want our institutions to withdraw from joint ventures with Israeli institutions. We want the termination of exchange programs with Israeli institutions, the refusal to host Israeli scholars representing Israeli institutions or the Israeli state, as opposed to presenting research in their own personal capacities. And we want the disinvestment from Israeli local or international companies which are complicit in the seizure and occupation of Palestinian land, or which support Israel's apartheid rule over the Palestinian people. As well as contributing to the UK campaign for the boycott by signing the academic commitment as individual academics and encouraging your colleagues to do likewise, there are a number of steps you can take, and this is very much the action that Ed was talking about. Form a Palestine solidarity group at your university made up of staff sympathetic to the academic boycott of Israeli universities, with the aim of persuading the university to adopt the academic boycott as university policy. In the trade union branch at your university, propose a motion to adopt the academic boycott, circulate this booklet, our booklet that we're launching tonight. We want copies in all universities being disseminated to all academics. You need to raise it for discussion and then propose motions in departments, schools and faculties to adopt the academic boycott as policy. We need to raise the discussion with staff representatives and then propose motions to adopt the academic boycott as the policy of academic boards and university senates. And we need to raise the discussion and then propose motions to adopt the academic boycott as university policy with boards of governors and university councils. At every level of university functioning and university structures, we need to be raising the issue and pushing for our academic boycott. We are at a point now where some of us may feel some relief that in spite of violations, the ceasefire is tentatively holding and there is some reduction in the daily death toll in Gaza. But the so-called peace plan is vague, steeped in anti-Palestinian bias, and offers no viable pathway to lasting peace or justice. The boycott, divestment and sanctions movement has deemed it a scheme primarily designed by Israel's fascist government to save it from its unprecedented global isolation. Netanyahu himself has urged Israel to become a super Sparta in acknowledgement of this growing isolation. So we must beware the ceasefire and peace plan, with all their flaws, we must beware of those being used to argue that boycott is no longer needed. It very much is. Valuing academic freedom alongside justice means that we have to continue doing everything we can to protect and advance the fundamental rights and academic freedom of fellow academics and students, and maintain this position until the State of Israel complies with international law, respects universal principles of human rights. Signing the commitment and joining the boycott is something, and I would even say the least, we can all do. Thank you very much.
People may know that I have been a supporter of the one democratic state in Palestine for many years, for decades, in fact. I always saw it as the only endpoint for this horrendous conflict situation between Israel and the Palestinians. There was only one way, it seemed to me, that it could end reasonably, and that was for Palestinians and Jewish Israelis to share, to be equal citizens in a democratic Palestine. That's in summary what I've always believed in. Now, you are right very much to ask that question, because this belief has been strained quite a bit in the last 2 years. And I assure you, it's not only what one might imagine, you can imagine that given the behavior, not just of the Israeli army, but what is very important is the Israeli people who support the army. Over 80%, maybe 80 to 90% support these actions. That's what's very scary. Now, the idea that Palestinians should be asked to live together with these murderers was something that you can imagine is very difficult. However, I know more specifically in practical terms what it meant. I was in Jordan. I spent the summer in Amman. And I can tell you that the atmosphere was probably different. There had always been a fairly benign, liberal environment in the society in Amman. And people were able to certainly distinguish between Jews and Israelis. However, I saw that break down. I saw lots of, to me, quite absurd, but you have to listen to that. People who said, they went back to the Quran and they talked about the Prophet Muhammad and what enormous difficulties he'd had with the Jewish tribes in Arabia, and that they betrayed him. There was this kind of thing, this conversation going on, and saying you can't trust the Jews, this is what they do, etc. Now there were also, but there was some people had these views, but many people said, became quite, I remember I gave a lecture while I was there, and people being virtually abusive. They said to me, what on earth are you asking for? That we should live with these murderers? That we should actually regard them as human beings? They don't regard us as humans, never. And so I said, well, what's your solution? They said they have to go from where they came. They have to get out, and it's not my problem. So many times I came across this where I said, but what about, okay, they're settlers, and they're children of settlers, they're descendants of settlers, but they're there. So what are we going to do about it? They're not my problem, not my problem. They put themselves there. They've got to actually watch out for their own future. This kind of hardening of attitude, it doesn't surprise me. Now, I've thought it over in my mind because your question is very apposite. And I fully understand. I understand people's reactions. Of course, against a background of genocide, against the fact that many people in Amman have relatives in the West Bank or in Gaza, and they know what's been happening. So, it's very difficult. In the end, what I've done is, I suppose, a sort of a cop-out, is first of all, the one state, the one democratic state, is not for now and not for the near future. It cannot happen. It really cannot happen. Yet, I haven't changed my mind. Ultimately, it must be the ultimate endpoint. Whatever happens in between, there is no other way forward, I think, than that for the people who came there. I'm talking about the Jewish Israelis, however they came there, they're there. And the people of Palestine who are there and the ones who were expelled, like me, they have to go home. And these groups together, they have to live in a democracy with equal rights, irrespective of their origins.
There's an influential book by Mahmoud Mamdani called Citizen, what is it called? Neither Settler Nor Native. And he argues that the reason South Africa succeeded in its post-apartheid period was because people relinquished the identities of white settler and indigenous black native, and they believed in a new identity, which was the Rainbow Nation. And so I suppose his argument in the book is that for Israel-Palestine to have a hope of a kind of one-state solution, what you have to struggle for, fight for, is for people to relinquish those prior identities: Israeli, Jewish, settler, Palestinian, native, And that's the kind of putting it in a sort of discursive way of making the argument. So it's a really difficult argument. But just very briefly, there was a specific question about the comparison with South Africa. There were big differences in South Africa. There was an international boycott movement that started in 1960. It was truly global. In the 1980s, big American corporations joined it. Kodak was the first, said no trade. It got support from presidents from the late 1980s, so it was a very long-term struggle. It was global. There were anomalies throughout that period. I discovered recently that Switzerland and Japan, in fact, increased their investments in the 1980s in the apartheid regime. But it was a mass movement that took a long time. And also, crucially, it worked because it was in conjunction with there being a very strong trade union movement within South Africa that brought the economy to a halt. There were military defeats in Angola that were really important for the South African Defense Force, was humiliated by the Cuban and Angolan armies. And there was civic unrest. There were boycott movements led by the United Democratic Front. So there were all these things that came together. But what that means, I think, is that because those equivalent movements aren't available or have been crushed and annihilated in Israel, the international boycott becomes even more strategically important. And so it becomes, I quote Rashid Khalidi in the book, who says that the BDS movement has done more than Fatah and Hamas ever to help liberate Palestine. But, having said all of that, I think the boycott in all its manifestations and in every sector is incredibly important. But one thing I will just say, ending off the comparison with South Africa, there was a book published in 1989 by South Africa's finest political analyst. It was an edited book reflecting on when apartheid would end. All of them there was a consensus. All of them agreed, and these were professors of political studies and histories, all of them agreed that it was a decade away. And that book came out, I remember the book launched in late 1989, and Mandela was released within months, and South Africa was free. So the moral I always take from that memory is that when change comes, it comes very quickly. You can't anticipate it. And so it is the old saying about, the hour before the dawn is the darkest, and just to keep remembering that political change, when it does happen, happens. Nobody expected apartheid to end. I don't care what people say now. I was there, I read the books. It was a shock. It happened very quickly, and I'm hoping, and this is what I cling to for Palestine, is that these kinds of struggles, they build momentum over a long period of time. They take incredible sacrifices, but victory is certainly possible, and I believe certain.
No university in the UK that I am aware of has divested or introduced a boycott. And I'd like to say that in 2020, October 2020, the Minister of Education wrote all the universities and demanded that they adopt the IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which is being used now daily to silence pro-Palestinians. He said by December, by Christmas, 75% of the universities in the UK adopted it. They didn't consult any of their internal experts. The people inside the universities are, for the most part, against it, blah, 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 blah. The issue is this. On the one hand, and one more fact, is that the universities over the past 2-3 decades have become corporations. Yeah. They are not, the managers are the top, don't see us, the staff members or the students as their constituency. They do not answer to us, they answer to the people, the council, which are usually corporate leaders, okay? So within this balance of power, that on the one hand, the government is saying, adopt the IHRA, or the government is saying anti-Semitism is everywhere, and any sign of divestment and boycott is a sign of anti-Semitism, and us on the ground, students and staff that are fighting for this boycott, divestment, and sanctions from our own institutions, it's obvious who the administrators are going to listen to. Okay, and they'll listen to it so long as they can. We just need to continue putting sticks in the wheels. That's what we can do. But this is the balance of power. We need to see it with our eyes. We can't ignore it, and we have to continue, and we're doing it. We're managing, I think, with little. So the university will not come out with a boycott statement, but it could be that next time that it looks at software, it won't take Palantir.
In terms of examples of successes, I think was the last question, in terms of BDS campaigning. Last year, I think it was in August, the USS, which is obviously the big pension scheme for all post-92 universities, it's like the second biggest private pension scheme in the country. They divested, they had about 80 million in like Israeli bonds, which they divested. And I think there have been other divestment wins, which I think is interesting because it's easier for institutions to mask the politics of divestment. So when USS did this, even though it came after lots of correspondence from UCU pushing them politically on it, they claimed it was like a purely financial decision and it was about their fiduciary duty. And I think, so with divestment, they can mask it, say it's just financial, whereas, implementing the academic boycott is a purely political thing, which is going to be very difficult. They can't dress that up and pretend it's not political. So I think that's why it takes us much longer to make progress on the academic boycott, but I guess we have to keep pushing.
Yeah. I think that's certainly the message of this evening, that we just have to keep going and keep, involving as many people as we can. This is a movement that needs to grow. And the part this evening has been about that. It's really the start of a campaign to disseminate the BRICUP booklet and to encourage academics to sign the academic commitment. 800 have signed already, but we need that to be thousands. We intend to follow up this launch event with a tour of UK universities and want to encourage relevant organisations and union branches to order multiple copies of the book for distribution to members. So if you haven't already, please purchase a booklet on your way out, or one or more booklets on your way out. You can also order them online. And please let us know if you would like to organise a BRICUP meeting on the academic boycott in your own institution, because that's something that we would very much like to get off the ground. So I think this is probably the point where I need to say thank you to you all for coming, but particularly thank you to our brilliant panel. And safe journey home.